Michael stood in his backyard, hands on his hips, staring at the above-ground pool that had been the centerpiece of family summers for 5 years running. The blue vinyl sides have faded slightly despite his diligent maintenance, and the deck he built around it, a weekend project that had stretched into 3, was showing signs of weathering. The morning sun reflected off the water's surface, creating dancing patterns on the surrounding fence. It was beautiful in its way, but Michael couldn't ignore the growing feeling that it was time for a change. "Dad, are you sure about this?" His 14-year-old daughter Emma stood in the doorway, her expression caught between understanding and nostalgia. Michael nodded slowly. "I think so, Em. When was the last time you actually swam in it?" "4th of July. Emma shrugged, stepping onto the patio. "Maybe. Jake hasn't used it at all this summer." Her 17-year-old brother had once been the pool's biggest champion, executing cannonballs that had become neighborhood legends. Now he was too busy with his summer job and preparing for college applications. "Exactly," Michael said, walking around the perimeter. "And your mom and I use it, what, maybe once a month? That's a lot of chemicals, electricity for the pump, and weekend maintenance for something that's basically becoming a giant birdbath." The decision hadn't come lightly. Last night's family meeting had been surprisingly emotional, with everyone sharing memories of pool parties, water fights, and lazy summer afternoons. But the practical reality was undeniable. The kids were growing up, interests were changing, and the pool had become more obligation than joy. "What would we do with the space?" Emma asked, joining her father at the edge of the pool. Michael smiled, warming to the possibilities. "I was thinking maybe a garden patio, something with a fire pit where we could still hang out as a family, but without the hassle. We could plant some of those flowering shrubs your mom loves, maybe set up a proper grilling station." Emma nodded, beginning to visualize it. "That actually sounds pretty nice. We could use it more of the year, too." "Exactly," Michael said, feeling more confident in the decision. "This pool really only works for 3 months out of 12, and even then, we're at the mercy of the weather." Later that afternoon, Michael sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, researching the proper way to dismantle an above-ground pool. He was surprised by the complexity. It wasn't just a matter of pulling a drain plug and folding up the liner. There were environmental considerations about where to drain the water, proper disposal methods for the chemicals, and the logistics of breaking down the structure without damaging any components that could be recycled or sold. He created a detailed checklist, ordered some specialized tools that would arrive by Thursday, and even found a local guy who might be interested in buying the pump and filter system if they were still in good condition. "This is going to be a full weekend project," he told his wife Sarah as she reviewed his plans. Sarah squeezed his shoulder supportively. "Well, the whole family will help. Jake already said he'd reschedule his Saturday shift to pitch in." Michael nodded gratefully. It was the right decision for their family, even if it felt a bit like closing a chapter. He scheduled the work for the following weekend, unaware that what should have been a straightforward home improvement project was about to become an unexpected neighborhood drama. The Patterson house next door had always been something of a mystery to Michael. In the 8 years his family had lived in the neighborhood, Diane Patterson had maintained a peculiar relationship with them, distant yet somehow intrusive. Her 2-story colonial sat slightly elevated compared to Michael's ranch-style home, giving her windows a perfect vantage point into his backyard. Michael first noticed Diane's unusual interest in his pool 3 summers ago. He had been teaching Emma how to dive when he glanced up to see Diane and her 2 children, a boy and girl around 10 and 8, watching intently from their second-floor window. It wasn't just a casual glance. They had pulled chairs up to the window, as if settling in for a show. "Dad," Emma had whispered, following his gaze. "They're always watching us. It's kind of creepy." Michael had brushed it off then. "They probably just wish they had a pool too," he'd said, though the intensity of their observation had unsettled him. As the summers passed, the pattern continued. Sometimes Michael would wave politely when he caught their eyes, but Diane never waved back. She'd simply continue watching, occasionally making comments to her children that Michael couldn't hear. The Patterson kids never came over to swim, though nearly every other child in the neighborhood had received invitations to pool parties over the years. Sarah had attempted friendliness initially, inviting Diane to a neighborhood barbecue during their second summer with the pool. Diane had declined curtly, explaining that she didn't approve of the noise level the gatherings created. Yet paradoxically, her family seemed endlessly fascinated by those very gatherings, their faces fixtures at the upstairs windows. Last summer, things had taken a stranger turn. Michael was cleaning the pool one Saturday morning when Diane's son timidly approached the fence. "Mom wants to know what time you'll be done," the boy had said, his voice barely audible. Confused, Michael had asked, "Done with what?" "Cleaning," the boy replied. "She says we can't watch people swim if you're just doing maintenance." The comment had left Michael speechless. Before he could formulate a response, Diane had called her son back, throwing Michael a look that somehow combined entitlement with disapproval. That evening, Michael had discussed the incident with Sarah. "It's like they think we're running some kind of free water park for their viewing pleasure," he'd said, still bewildered. Sarah had sighed. "We should probably say something, set some boundaries." But they never did. Between work pressures and family commitments, confronting the odd behavior of their neighbors had never quite made it to the top of their priority list. They'd adapted instead, closing the patio umbrella when they wanted more privacy, scheduling family swim time when the Pattersons were known to be out. Now, as Michael finalized his pool removal plans, the thought of Diane's reaction hadn't even crossed his mind. The pool was, after all, on his property, purchased with his money and maintained with his time and resources. The fact that the Pattersons had developed some strange spectator relationship with it seemed irrelevant to his family's decision. Michael closed his laptop that Thursday night, satisfied with his preparations for the weekend project. He'd ordered a pizza to celebrate Jake's college application submission, and the family was gathering in the living room for a movie night. The pool would be gone by Sunday evening, and they could start planning the new patio space immediately. What Michael didn't realize was that across the property line, Diane Patterson was already in a state of agitation. She had overheard Jake mentioning the pool removal to a friend on the driveway that afternoon, and she was not pleased. Not pleased at all. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather for the pool project, clear skies, moderate temperature, and a light breeze. Michael woke at 6, excitement and a touch of nostalgia mingling as he brewed his first cup of coffee. By 7, he was in the backyard surveying his domain, mentally mapping out the day's tasks. "Morning, Dad," Jake said, appearing in sweatpants and an old t-shirt, his hair still mussed from sleep. "Thought you might want these." He handed over work gloves and a baseball cap. Michael smiled at his son. "Thanks for giving up your Saturday for this." Jake shrugged. "It's our pool, our project." The simple statement made Michael's chest tighten with pride. His son was growing up, becoming a partner rather than just a recipient of parental efforts. By 8, the whole family was involved. Sarah had set up a cooler with drinks and snacks on the patio. Emma was documenting the before state with her camera for a school project on transformation. Michael and Jake stood at the edge of the pool reviewing the drainage plan. "So we're running the hose down to that drainage ditch behind the Andersons." Jake confirmed, examining the length of hose Michael had purchased specifically for this purpose. Michael nodded. "Already cleared it with Bob. They'll flow away from everyone's foundations and into the larger stormwater system." He'd been meticulous in his research. Improper pool drainage could damage property, create sinkholes, or violate local regulations. They submerged the siphon pump and watched as the first of the water began its journey out of the pool. It would take hours to drain completely, giving them time to organize tools and prepare for the deconstruction phase. As the water level began noticeably dropping, Michael felt a strange sense of relief. The decision that had waited on him for months was finally in motion. The pool had been wonderful, but this change felt right. "Dad, I think we're being watched," Emma said quietly, nodding toward the Patterson house. Michael glanced up to see not just Diane at the window this time, but her husband Tom as well, a man Michael had exchanged perhaps 10 words with in 8 years. Their expressions were unmistakably disapproving. "Just focus on what we're doing," Michael said, turning back to their project. "It's our yard." By mid-morning, the pool was half drained, and they'd begun removing the surrounding deck planks. Jake and Michael worked in synchronized rhythm, with Sarah handling the labeling and organization of hardware for potential reuse. Even Emma had donned gloves to help stack the weathered but still useful lumber. "This is actually kind of therapeutic," Sarah commented, wiping sweat from her brow. "Like we're physically moving on to a new phase." Michael was about to reply when a sharp voice cut across the yard. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" The family turned in unison to see Diane Patterson standing at the edge of their properties, arms crossed tightly across her chest. She wore pressed khaki shorts and a polo shirt, as if she dressed for a confrontation rather than a Saturday at home. Michael straightened, setting down his drill. He'd known this moment might come, though he hoped to avoid it. "Morning, Diane," he called, keeping his tone deliberately casual. "We're taking down our pool. Been planning it for a while now." Diane's face tightened, her lips thinning to a nearly invisible line. Behind her, Michael could see her children peering around the corner of their house, expressions disappointed. "Without any notice to the neighborhood?" Diane demanded, taking a step closer. Michael exchanged a quick glance with Sarah, who raised an eyebrow in silent communication. This was exactly the entitled attitude they'd witnessed from afar but never directly confronted. "I wasn't aware we needed to notify anyone about changes to our own backyard," Michael replied evenly, feeling the first stirrings of what would soon become a much larger confrontation. "Actually," Diane continued, stepping fully onto Michael's property now, "there are neighborhood considerations you've completely ignored." Her voice carried across the yard, sharp enough to make Emma instinctively move closer to Sarah. Michael set his tools down carefully and walked to meet Diane halfway, preferring to keep the confrontation away from his family. Jake moved to follow, but Michael gave him a subtle hand signal to stay back. Diane, Michael began calmly, I understand this might be unexpected, but this is our pool on our property. Diane's face flushed, the color rising from her neck to her hairline in blotchy patches. Do you have any idea what this will do to our summer? My children look forward to watching people swim every day. It's part of their routine. The statement was so bizarre that Michael momentarily struggled to respond. Behind him, he heard Sarah make a small, incredulous sound. Your children watch our family swim? Michael asked, wanting to clarify the strange complaint. And you're upset that they won't be able to do that anymore. Don't play dumb, Diane snapped, her voice rising. You know perfectly well that your pool is visible from our windows. It's part of our property view. We bought this house specifically for the sight lines. Michael took a deep breath, trying to process the absurdity of her claim. Diane, when we installed the pool 5 years ago, you never contributed to its cost. You've never offered to help with maintenance. Your family has never been involved with our pool in any way except, apparently, watching us from your windows. We shouldn't have to pay for something we can see. Diane's hands were on her hips now, her stance confrontational. That's like saying we should pay for the sunset. By now, Jake had drifted closer despite Michael's earlier signal. That makes no sense, the teenager interjected. We're not the public park. Diane shot Jake a withering look. I wasn't talking to you, young man. This is between adults. Don't speak to my son that way, Michael said firmly, his patience wearing thin. Jake's right. Our backyard isn't a public amenity. We've decided as a family that the pool no longer suits our needs, and we're removing it. That's really all there is to it. Diane's expression shifted from anger to something more calculating. Tom is on the HOA board, you know. There are rules about property modifications. We don't have an HOA in this neighborhood. Diane, Sarah called from the patio, unable to remain silent any longer. You tried to start one 3 years ago, and nobody signed on. A flicker of embarrassment crossed Diane's face before her indignation returned full force. Well, there are city ordinances about noise and disruption. This construction is ruining our weekend peace. Michael gestured to their clearly organized work area. We're being as quiet and efficient as possible. We've secured all the proper permissions for the drainage. There's nothing disruptive about what we're doing. It's disruptive to our expectations, Diane nearly shouted, losing her composure entirely. My children will be devastated. We've watched your family swim for years. The statement hung in the air, its inherent strangeness highlighted by Diane's emotional delivery. Even she seemed to realize how it sounded as her expression faltered momentarily. I'm sorry your children will be disappointed, Michael said finally, his tone firm but not unkind. But this is our decision to make. Now, I'd appreciate it if you let us get back to our project. Diane stared at him, her breathing rapid and shallow. You'll regret this, Michael. You're being selfish and inconsiderate of your neighbors. This isn't over. As she turned to leave, she paused and added with surprising venom, You'll see exactly how much your precious privacy is going to cost you. She marched back across the invisible property line, her posture rigid with indignation. Michael returned to his family, who were watching the retreating figure with various expressions of disbelief. Well, Sarah said quietly, that was genuinely bizarre. Michael nodded, picking up his tools again. Let's just keep working. She'll calm down eventually. But as they resumed their tasks, Michael couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Diane's parting threat wasn't just empty words. The family worked steadily for the next 2 hours, trying to shake off the uncomfortable encounter with Diane. The pool was nearly drained now, and Michael and Jake had removed most of the surrounding deck. Sarah had organized the salvageable materials into neat piles while Emma documented their progress with her camera. I still can't believe she said that, Jake muttered as he and Michael disconnected the filter system. Like, we're supposed to keep our pool just so they can watch us swim? That's next level creepy. Michael nodded, focusing on loosening a stubborn bolt. Some people develop strange notions about what they're entitled to. Should we be worried? Sarah asked quietly when she brought over fresh water bottles. She seemed pretty angry. Michael straightened, stretching his back. What's she going to do? Sue us for removing our own pool? He smiled reassuringly, though a small part of him wondered just how far Diane might take this. By early afternoon, they'd made significant progress. The last of the water gurgled through the hose, and they were preparing to start removing the pool liner when a distinctive sound made them all pause, the unmistakable crunch of tires on their gravel driveway. Are we expecting anyone? Sarah asked, walking toward the side gate to check. Michael followed, wiping his hands on a rag. As they rounded the corner of the house, they both froze. A police cruiser sat in their driveway, its official markings catching the afternoon sunlight. 2 officers, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a younger woman, were already making their way to the front door. "What the hell?" Michael murmured, quickening his pace to intercept them. "Afternoon," he called, trying to keep his voice casual despite the tension coiling in his stomach. "Can I help you, officers?" The older officer turned, appraising Michael with experienced eyes. "Are you a homeowner?" "Yes, Michael Reynolds. This is my wife, Sarah." He gestured toward their backyard. "We're in the middle of removing our pool." The officers exchanged a glance that Michael couldn't quite interpret. "We received a complaint, Mr. Reynolds," the female officer explained, consulting her notepad. "Something about destruction of community property and creating a hazardous environmental situation." Sarah made a small, incredulous sound. "Community property? It's our pool." The male officer's expression softened slightly. "Ma'am, we're just following up on the report." The caller was quite insistent that this was some kind of shared neighborhood amenity being destroyed without proper consultation. Realization dawned on Michael. "Let me guess. Diane Patterson called you." The officers maintained their professional neutrality, but the slight shift in their posture told Michael he hit the mark. "We're also here about allegations of improper water drainage creating a flood risk," the female officer continued, though her tone had lost some of its official edge. Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Officers, would you like to see our setup? We've taken every precaution, including getting permission from our other neighbor to direct the drainage safely into the stormwater system." The officers followed Michael around to the backyard, where Jake and Emma stood frozen beside the half-dismantled pool, their expressions a mixture of confusion and concern. "Kids, these officers are just following up on a complaint," Michael explained calmly, trying to ease their worry. He turned to the police. "As you can see, we're being methodical. The drainage hose runs to the approved outlet behind the property." The male officer surveyed the scene, noting the organized workset and clear absence of any hazardous conditions. He walked the perimeter, checking the drainage setup while his partner spoke quietly into her radio. "So the neighbor claimed this was community property?" The male officer asked when he returned, a hint of amused disbelief in his voice. "Apparently she and her children have been watching us swim for years from their windows. She seems to think that gives them some kind of rights to our pool," Sarah explained. The female officer rejoined them, putting away her radio. "Well, Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds, it appears there's been a misunderstanding. Your property, your pool, you're well within your rights to remove it." As they spoke, Michael noticed movement at the Patterson house. Diane stood at her upstairs window, phone still in hand, watching the scene unfold with an expression of grim satisfaction that quickly morphed into confusion as she realized the officers weren't shutting down the pool removal. "Sorry about the disruption to your Saturday," the male officer said, tucking his notepad into his pocket. His name read Officer Daniels, and there was a hint of genuine apology in his voice. "Not your fault," Michael replied. "You were just doing your job." Officer Daniels glanced toward the Patterson house, where Diane had disappeared from the window. "Between us," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "this isn't our first visit to this neighborhood because of that household." His partner, Officer Rivera, nodded discreetly. 3 noise complaints about the Johnson family's graduation party. 2 calls about the Anderson kids playing basketball too aggressively. 1 report about suspicious characters that turned out to be the new family moving in down the street. "The Torres family," Sarah said, recognition dawning. "They mentioned someone called the police while they were unloading their moving van." Officer Daniels sighed. "Look, we take all calls seriously," but he trailed off, the implication clear. "We understand," Michael said, "and we appreciate you checking things out properly rather than just taking her word for it." Officer Rivera pulled out a business card and handed it to Michael. "If there are any further issues, you might want to document them. Not saying there will be, but some people don't let things go easily," Michael finished for her. "Exactly," she confirmed. "Take photos of your work progress. Keep any text messages or emails, just as a precaution." As the officers prepared to leave, Jake approached hesitantly. "So we can keep working on the pool, right?" "Absolutely," Officer Daniels assured him. "Your property, your decision." They all walked back to the front of the house, a sense of relief permeating the Reynolds family. The officers were almost to their cruiser when Diane emerged from her front door, marching purposefully across her lawn. "Officers, did you tell them to stop?" she called, her voice carrying across both properties. Officer Daniels turned with practiced patience. "Miss Patterson, as we explained on the phone before coming out, we can only intervene if there's a law being broken. The Reynolds family is well within their rights to remove their pool." Diane's face contorted with frustration. "But what about the environmental impact? The noise ordinance?" "Ma'am, we've inspected the site. They're draining the pool properly and working during permitted hours. There's no violation here," Officer Rivera stated firmly. "But," Diane began. "Ms. Patterson," Officer Daniels cut in, his professional demeanor tinged with weariness, "this is the 6th call you made to our department in 3 months. I strongly suggest you reconsider what constitutes an emergency requiring police response." Diane's mouth opened and closed silently, her indignation momentarily stymied by the public reminder of her pattern of behavior. Several neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by the unusual sight of a police cruiser in their quiet street. "This isn't over," Diane finally managed, turning on her heel and returning to her house, slamming the door with enough force to make her windows rattle. As the police cruiser pulled away, Michael noticed Bob Anderson approaching from next door, a six-pack of beer in hand. "Thought you might need this after whatever that was," Bob said, nodding toward the Patterson house. "Diane called the cops on you guys." Michael nodded, accepting the peace offering with gratitude. Apparently removing her own pool was a criminal offense. Bob chuckled, shaking his head. "Man, when she called them because my son's basketball was too orange, her actual complaint, I thought that was the peak. She's outdone herself." Sarah joined them, wiping her hands on a towel. "Thanks for the beer, Bob. Want to stick around? We could use an extra pair of hands for the liner removal." "Happy to help," Bob replied, rolling up his sleeves. "My wife's making her famous enchiladas later. You should all come over when you're done. Might as well make the most of being neighborhood criminals together." The tension of the afternoon dissolved into laughter, and as they returned to the backyard, Michael felt a surprising sense of gratitude. Diane's ridiculous escalation had somehow strengthened their connection to the neighbors who actually mattered.